New research is changing everything we thought we knew about choline's impact on the cow and her calf, and top scientists have a lot to say about it. They are presenting new research that supports choline as a required nutrient to optimize milk production, choline as a required nutrient to support a healthy transition, choline as a required nutrient to improve calf health and growth, and choline as a required nutrient to increase colostrum quantity. This new research is solidifying choline's role as a required nutrient for essentially every cow, regardless of health status, milk production level, or body condition score. Learn more about the science that is changing the game and the choline source that is making it happen. Reassure precision-release choline from Balchem. Visit balchem.com/scientistsay to learn more.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Real Science Lecture Series. My name is Scott Sorrell, Director of Global Marketing at Balchem. The vast majority of transition cow research over the last 25 years has focused on the dry cow. Today, we welcome Dr. Tom Overton from the Cornell University to discuss the other half of the equation, fresh cow nutrition. Dr. Overton is a professor of dairy management and chair of the Department of Animal Science at Cornell University. Tom is recognized widely for his research and extension efforts related to nutritional physiology of the transition dairy cow. He serves as director of the statewide Pro Dairy Extension Program at Cornell. He also teaches a dairy cattle nutrition course for undergraduates and co-teaches a similar course for veterinary students. He served as Associate Director of Agriculture and Food Systems for Cornell Cooperative Extension from 2014 to 2019. In this college-level position, he worked to build additional regional agricultural specialist extension teams and strengthen several college-level extension programs through his leadership. Dr. Overton has a BS from Cornell University and MS and PhD from the University of Illinois. He has authored or co-authored more than 90 peer-reviewed scientific publications and numerous conference proceedings, extension publications, and popular press articles. Dr. Overton, welcome back to the Real Science Lecture Series. The floor is now yours.
Hey, Scott. Thanks so much for the kind introduction. And thanks to you and the rest of the folks at Balchem for asking me to join. Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining this morning, taking your time. I said morning in my world. I know some of you in other parts of the world, it's probably afternoon or evening, hopefully not middle of the night. But yeah, we're going to talk about fresh cows today. And it's a relatively new area of research, believe it or not. Okay. And, I say that, and Scott kind of alluded to this, and we're part of this as well. But when we look at the transition cow, and transition cow nutrition research has been going on for about 30 years, 25 to 30 years. And the majority of that work is really focused on the dry cow. And, we would do a study, we would vary diets during the dry period. And then, after calving, most of the time researchers would just feed cows whatever the herd was feeding. Researchers focused on lactating cows. They often didn't start until several weeks after calving. Again, the researchers wanted the cows to be healthy and off to a good start. And so we've kind of had this gap. And so I do note that again, we've had several studies published over the last 10 years focused specifically on feeding the fresh cow. Scotty, you still seeing me okay? I just had a network thing pop up.
Everything's still working fine on my end.
Okay, good.
All right.
Okay. All right, so but fresh cow diets are not new, right? And certainly there's lots of herds where the herd will transition the cows directly onto a high cow type diet. Lots of herds also may use a fresh cow diet for 2 or 3 weeks after calving. But the common themes that I see is they're commonly based on the high cow diet, okay, with a few tweaks, okay, and some of those tweaks might be a little less starch, a little more physically effective fiber, but oftentimes that's less than a pound or a kilo or half a kilo or so of chopped straw or hay in the diet. Okay, not very much. Additional protein or amino acids, maybe some fat, And then also, strategic addition of other nutrients. So again, protected choline being a prime example of that, right? Because again, response is certainly both before and after calving in most studies. Okay, and a lot of times, then the nutritionist, the farm will gauge success based on how the cows seem to be doing, right? So it's been kind of a pretty informal, less controlled way to kind of think about these things. Okay. So some of the key questions that have been floating around both within academia and also the industry. One of the big ones has been, how fermentable should fresh cow diets be? Okay. And so there's been a camp or a school of thought that we really should be feeding, lower starch diets to fresh cows. And I'll show you some of the data on that. Another question, what about starch fermentability, right? And the notion here is that if we're too fermentable in that rumen, that we probably will decrease feed intake in the cows. And so that's been a bit of the school of thought there. And I'll take you through the data that sort of supports, and also some that doesn't support that. Okay. Another question, how important is physically effective fiber in fresh cow diets? And again, that's that fiber that stimulates, provides rumen function, right? So it provides a good rumen mat, stimulates chewing and rumination, which obviously relates to buffer production, and helps, mixing and acid absorption and things like that. And then thirdly, what about protein supply to that cow? Okay, does that fresh cow maybe have some needs that we maybe not be accounting for in our diet formulation? So to starch or not to starch, that is the question. Okay, so we've got several groups here, number of experiments now that have been conducted at University of Alberta, Minor, our group at Cornell, and then also Michigan State. Okay, and some of these have focused on starch level in the fresh diet. Okay, and so you got 5 papers here that have looked at starch percentage or starch level in the fresh diet. You've got a study here that focused on, this is out of Michigan State, that focused on starch source, right? Comparing dry ground corn with high moisture corn, as you'll see. Okay, and then we've got several papers here, or a couple papers here, that looked at both starch source and level in that fresh diet. And I'm not going to show you results from all these papers, but I'll show you enough to probably confuse you, and then we'll reconcile. Okay. So this is one of the first ones. This was Heather Dan Brown Nelson. This was published at the 2011 Cornell Nutrition Conference, which those proceedings can be accessed online for free. They had 72 Holstein cows. Again, they were entering secondary grade of lactation. They fed them a pretty typical high straw controlled energy diet for 40 days dry. And then at calving, they put them on 3 different treatments. Okay, and they had a low starch treatment, about 21% for the first 91 days in milk. They had a medium starch treatment, so they were 23% for the first 21 days in milk, followed by a higher starch diet until 91 days in milk. And then in a high starch diet, about 25.5%. Now that's not, I wouldn't necessarily consider a super high starch diet, but it was high in the high treatment in that study for the first 91 days in milk. Just to show you their diets here, again, you've got low, medium, and high. Okay, corn silage, haylage, forage base. They had a bit of wheat straw in there in the diet. Okay, and then they varied their treatments by, when they went to low to high starch, they had dry ground corn, so finely ground cornmeal, went from about 7% up to about 17% of the diet. And as they increased the cornmeal to increase the starch, they backed off on things like soy hulls and wheat midds. Okay, so replacing non-forage fiber, with the cornmeal. So you see the numbers down below in terms of NDF levels. Again, that obviously went down as they pulled out the non-forage fiber. Sugar levels around 6%, and then starch 21, 23, and almost about just under 26. Okay. All right, so if you look at their results, and this is the first 13 weeks of lactation, we're really just going to look at the dry matter intake and the milk yield here, the first 2 rows. And so you've got the low, the medium, and then the high. And what we see here is that intakes and milk yield were very similar between the low and the medium treatments, but clearly were decreased when they started feeding the higher starch diet, beginning at calving. So they lost about 4 to 5 kilos of milk, and then they lost kilo and a half anyway of dry matter intake. So again, so if the only study you looked at or considered when you're thinking about feeding a fresh cow was this one, you would conclude that feeding a higher starch diet is indeed negative, okay, and that you should feed a lower starch diet to these fresh cows. All right, then Alberta, University of Alberta, Masito Oba, his group came along. They had 61 Holstein cows. They had some first calf heifers, primiparous, and also multiparous cows in there. The treatment's fed from calving through 12 weeks post-calving. Okay, they had a control, which is a high starch diet, and that starch actually was pretty high at 29% of dry matter. And then they replaced that starch with dried distillers grains, so low starch, and that was 19%. So they had a big treatment difference here between these two diets. Now, they were barley silage based. Okay, and then they had some rolled corn, and then essentially they swapped out barley for dried distillers grains. And of course, barley is going to be even more fermentable than corn. So not only was the diet high in starch content, but also would tend to be high in starch fermentability as well. Okay, and again, they ended up right in that 29%, 19% starch for those two diets. Now, interesting, in their case, they had no effect on milk yield. They had no effect on milk fat yield or milk protein yield. Energy corrected milk was the same. Okay, they did see a treatment by parity interaction. Okay, here such that again the older cows fed the control actually arguably had a little bit higher dry matter intake. The cows fed the first calf heifers arguably a lower dry matter intake. And again, the overall effect of treatment was kind of a wash. Okay, rumen pH was not different between the two treatments. pH, minutes per day under 5.8 was not different. Okay, area under that curve also was not different. Okay, a lot of variability in that measurement. But kind of the bottom line there is this study showed really no negative effect or very little negative effects of feeding a higher starch diet over quite a low starch diet. All right, then we came along. This is part of Maris McCarthy's PhD work here. We had 70 Holstein cows. We had some first calf heifers and also mostly older cows. We fed them a high straw, moderate energy diet close up, and then at calving, 1 of 2 diets, either a lower starch or higher starch, real similar to where Minor was with their treatments and things like that. And then again, beginning at 22 days in milk, all cows were fed the higher starch diet. We also had a rumensin treatment in the study, but I'm going to focus on the starch. All right, if you look at a diet composition, again, prepartum, 40% of dry matter corn silage, conventional corn silage, 20% of dry matter wheat straw. You see, again, some cornmeal, some non-forage fiber, and some protein. Again, pretty standard, diet for us. After calving, we transitioned them on to a BMR corn silage haylage base. Okay, we did end up increasing wheat straw to a pretty significant level in this diet. The BMR and the haylage ended up being very fermentable, highly digestible, both, and so we needed some more physically effective fiber. But we'll get into that a little bit later. Okay, you look at very similar to Minor. We set up our treatments by varying cornmeal and the non-forage fiber. So when we went from high starch to low starch, we dropped the finely ground corn and pulled in a little bit of corn germ meal, some citrus, and some soy. Whoops. And in our case, I went too far. Let's go back. Sorry. Okay. We basically had opposite results to Minor. Okay, and if you look here at our cows fed the higher starch diet, actually had higher dry matter intakes and higher milk yield over the first 3 weeks after calving. And so again, opposite results to Minor. Okay, and so again, I'm showing you kind of a mixed bag of results here. Okay, all right, Michigan State. Mike Allen's group, again, 48 Holstein cows entering second integrated lactation. They had, a 2x2 factorial here. They were looking at chromium propionates versus control. I'm not going to talk about that treatment, but I am going to talk about this dry ground versus high moisture corn, fed from calving through day 28. Okay, so pretty straightforward study design. Corn silage and alfalfa silage base, some alfalfa hay in that diet. Dry ground corn basically replaced pound for pound on a dry matter basis with high moisture. Okay, so again, that high moisture corn is going to be more fermentable. And they ran their starch levels around 26 to 27%, okay, of dry matter. Okay. All right, look at their results here. Okay, so days 1 to 28. Okay, the cows fed the more fermentable, corn actually made more milk. So they made about 3 kilos more milk here. Fat and protein yields were not different. Energy corrected milk was not significantly different. Dry matter intake was not different. Cumulative dry matter intake was the same. Okay, so or essentially the same. So clearly, again, no negative effects of feeding a more fermentable corn source, especially relative to dry matter intake or really anything else, and arguably a little more milk volume there. All right, and then again, another Michigan State study here. And so this was, Albornoz and Allen. So again, 52 cows, 2x2 factorial arrangement treatments from calving to 23 days of milk, had a low versus high starch treatment. Okay, so 22% versus 28. And then within each of those, looked at dry ground corn versus high moisture. Okay, so again, alfalfa silage and grass hay base. You see again, higher levels of dry ground or high moisture in the high starch diet, and again replaced essentially pound for pound on a dry matter basis again. So starch levels here around 21 to 22 for the low starch, and then 27 to 28 for the high starch. All right, let's look at their results. Okay, and again, just orient you to the table here. Low starch, high starch, and then dry ground versus high moisture within each of those. Okay, and in this study, what was interesting is that essentially there were no effects of level by itself. Okay, so no difference between that 22 versus 28, but a bunch of source effects here. Okay, and also it's a trend here for a level by source interaction here on dry matter intake. And my interpretation of this is that this level by source, essentially look at the low starch diet and the high starch diet. So cows for the high moisture corn on the higher starch level took a bigger hit on dry matter intake, right? So that would support, again, in this case, more fermentability was maybe not good relative to intake. Okay, again, source effect primarily on cumulative dry matter intake. Again, lower with the high moisture, lower milk yield with the high moisture, lower fat yield, lower protein, lower energy corrected milk with the high moisture corn. And remember, in a previous study, they showed a positive response, or certainly no negative responses to the high moisture corn versus dry ground. All right, so what gives, right? I'm probably thoroughly confused you here with the these all this mixed results relative to starch, a level, starch source. You start digging into the papers, though, there were some meaningful differences, I think, between diets. And so the two studies, the study out of our group and then the one study out of Michigan State here, with high moisture corn, we're feeding a lot higher forage NDF levels. So there was more fiber in those diets coming from forage sources than would be typical for a high cow diet. The studies that were neutral and negative were feeding, in this study here, they were down at only 22% of dry matter as forage NDF, which still is a little bit higher than a typical high cow diet, but not much. This Alberta study, the diet was 40%, forage. This study out of Minor, 50% forage as a percentage of dry matter. And then this other study here was quite low in terms of forage NDF. Okay, so this got us, some experience that we had got us playing around with more physically effective fiber, in those fresh diets. And instead of, being half a kilo or so or a pound or so, we might be 2 or 3 pounds. We were actually about 4 pounds of chopped straw in our diet, in our research diet, and that probably would be a high water mark. Okay. But nonetheless, we've had some positive experiences there in the field. But then we actually decided to do some research, and the question would be: can you go too far with higher PE, NDF, pick your forage fiber, physically effective fiber metric? PNDF, UNDF 240, PE UNDF, so physically effective UNDF 240. And you're probably guessing that if I'm asking this question, the answer is yes, you can go too far. Okay. All right, so we did a study. This is Sarah LeCount's part of our PhD work in our group. So we decided to look at low versus high fiber diets post-calving. We had a prepartum diet here, again, based on conventional corn silage, straw, and a grain mix from there. Okay, nothing too remarkable there relative to what we usually do. Okay, and then we had a low fiber diet or a high fiber diet fed beginning at calving. And essentially what we ended up doing is we really wanted to look at straw differences here. So we were down to a very low straw inclusion rate, percent of dry matter, a higher straw inclusion rate, percent of dry matter. And what happened was our farm manager at the time had acquired some hay from alfalfa hay from Kansas, and actually encouraged us to use that instead of haylage to deal with some variability stuff and things like that was going on at the time. And this alfalfa hay was about 39% NDF, and so we were like, "Hey, that looks pretty good, relative to where you want alfalfa hay to be." The problem with it, figured out later, was it was 50% of that NDF was UNDF 240. So half of that fiber was actually undigested or indigestible in the cow. Okay, and so we essentially overshot our UNDF target. Okay, so we were intending to have higher UNDF in these diets. We ended up about 2 units higher in UNDF for both diets than we intended. Okay, the low fiber diet was where we were intending the high fiber diet to be, and then the high fiber is way high. Okay, and so when you do that, when you overshoot that target, prepartum intakes here on 15 kilos, that looks good, but you lose intake, right? So too much bulk, too much physically effective fiber, too much UNDF. So we lost dry matter intake. We lost milk yield. Okay. We tended to lose energy corrected milk. Rumination, interestingly, was the same. Okay. But anyway, so when we went too far, we held the cows back. Okay, and so that also shows up. You see this again in dry matter intake. These cows again fed these diets for about 4 weeks, and we put them on the same diet. They came back. Okay, but clearly we lagged in dry matter intake. These cows were consuming more UNDF. They were trying. Okay, but clearly, too much, and milk yield also was lower for cows fed that high fiber diet. And then we look at things like NEFAs and ketones and glucose and energy balance. Those all went the direction you might think they would go based on us trying to put too much fiber in that diet. These cows had, these cows fed the higher fiber diet. They had higher NEFAs. They had higher ketones, okay, lower blood glucose, and more negative energy balance. So again, all not good things from our perspective. And that's sometimes how research goes. Okay. So again, but I do think that in a lot of these diets, post-cat, there's data from Greg Penner and others where, these cows can get acidotic during the immediate post-fresh period. And so I do think there's an opportunity maybe for a little more fiber in that diet, but I think you got to be careful for how long you do that. And so I'm going to illustrate this again. This is that Michigan State study where they looked at high moisture corn versus dry ground, and they had a high fiber, high forage NDF level in that fresh diet. Okay. And what you see here in terms of intake is these cows take off just fine on intake, and they get to about 10 to 14 days and they stall out here. You kind of see them stall out here. And then they switched them on to a more typical high cow forage NDF level, and the intakes took off again. Okay, and so, again, so if you're gonna play around anyway with a little more fiber in these fresh cow diets, especially forage fiber, it might only be a 10 to 14, certainly no more than 21-day strategy. And again, it's not all or nothing here as well. You can kind of work your way into it. The one useful tool I think we have to let us know if we go too far would be blood ketones. You can do some before and after stuff with some blood ketones in those fresh cows. And, if you start seeing the blood ketones pop up, maybe you're pushing the fiber too hard. Obviously, you might see it in dry matter intakes for herds. They're doing a good job monitoring dry matter intakes. All right, going to kind of wrap up here. Just do a little bit with metabolizable protein, amino acids in the fresh cow. Okay. So, we've known forever that most cows undergo some degree of negative energy balance, and they come back usually by, 42 days post-calving, plus or minus. Okay. But cows also, we can calculate a negative protein balance as well. And so this was done a number of years ago. Alan Bell was the one who and Buzz Burhans and I were the authors on this paper. And again, we calculated metabolizable protein balance here in these post-calving cows from a study that Buzz had conducted. And so, just like a negative energy balance, we can calculate a negative protein balance. And so, they're almost 600 grams negative on protein balance by around day 7 after calving. And then that protein balance kind of recovered, and they're actually back into neutral by about 3 weeks after calving. So about 21 days after calving. So, this was a study that got our attention as well as some others. This was done by Mogens Larsen and the group in Denmark, and published in 2014. And essentially what they were trying to do in this study was just say, okay, if we gave cows enough protein, if we supplied them more protein to just really eliminate this negative protein balance, we're not trying to go above, but just trying to eliminate that negative protein balance, what would these cows do? And so they had 8 Holstein cows. So it was a real small study, entering second lactation. They all had rumen cannulas. And so these cows got either a water control, or or casein, right, which would be an ideal protein source, a source of metabolizable amino acids infused into the abomasum just to meet that approximate calculated deficit, in MP. And so, they supplied casein at 360 grams per day at 1 day in milk. So it's about 3/4 of a pound, 720 grams per day. That'd be about, a pound and a half anyway at 2 days in milk. And then what they did is they backed off on the infusion each day as cows' intakes increased. Again, they were just trying to increase the protein supply and then again, reduce it as the cow's own intakes caught up. And so what did they find, right? So look at dry matter intake here up top. There was no difference in dry matter intake between the 2 treatments. If you look here at the MP supply, again, when they added in the amount they're infusing post-ruminally, again, that's simulating basically feeding bypass protein, had a big jump here in MP supply, again, by design, and then they kind of leveled off here as the cows, intakes caught up, but they got a big milk response. They got about 7 kilos. That's 15, 16 pounds more milk in cows given the additional casein. They've done some further studies. Been some work at Ohio State that also substantiates maybe some advantage for additional protein, post calving as well beyond what we normally would do. And so Trent Westhoff. Sorry. So Trent Westhoff. Yeah. Okay. Good. So Trent Westhoff, he just actually defended his PhD just in the last couple of weeks here at Cornell, working with Sabina Mann, and we wanted to do a study really looking at protein supply both before and after calving. And so, what Trent did here is fed cows, fed a kind of typical far off diet. And then we had a control, which is kind of industry standard, kind of MP levels, which in this case was about 39 grams of MP per pound of dry matter. Okay. And then we wanted to go 300 to 400 grams above. And so we ended up with this diet here on 51 grams of MP per pound of dry matter. Okay. And we did that for 28 days before calving. One design note, and both before and after calving, is we basically fixed methionine and lysine levels at grams per megacal of metabolizable energy, right? And actually, ME intakes did not differ between the treatments either before calving or after calving. So we essentially fixed methionine and lysine across the treatment. So really look at the effects of all the other amino acids in this time frame. Okay, and then post calving. These cows that were on both these pre-partum treatments, they either went to either a control, right? So again, pretty industry typical for high cow diet, level of MP, per pound of dry matter, and then or a high. And so we boosted it up to just under 60 grams of MP per pound of dry matter. Again, we were trying to get at that 300 to 400 grams difference in total MP supply. And then at day 22, so we did the post-calving diets for 21 days. At day 22, we transitioned these cows onto kind of a common diet, again, pretty in the range of where a lot of folks would be for high cow type diets and things like that. All right. So what do we find, right? So probably this is milk and milk components from calving to 21 days in milk, okay? Bottom line is that Trent saw a big milk response here, okay, and especially to postpartum high protein, right? Saw not really a whole lot of milk response here. And you can look at either milk yield or energy corrected milk here. We'll do energy corrected milk. Didn't see a lot of response or really no response to more protein before calving, unless they went on to that high diet after calving. In fact, these cows that were fed the combination of high actually made the most energy corrected milk in early lactation. Okay, so saw a pretty big milk response there, by those cows fed the high protein diet or higher protein diet after calving. Looking for carryover responses here. So after these cows went back onto a common diet, so these cows largely, maintained a significant portion of that milk response. So again, the control high and the high, they're about 11 pounds per day more energy corrected milk, compared to the others. So again, nice milk response to that, to more protein post calving. And again, our models don't account for this. So there clearly are some things going on with protein in these post fresh cows that, again, we just don't really account for. And again, looks like there's opportunities here for response. So just to kind of wrap up here, some other areas of opportunity. Again, we've got a lot of research now backing strategic use of nutrients and also feed additives. Okay, a lot of people tend to lump these things into call them all feed additives, but I like to differentiate because clearly things like choline and methionine, lysine, chromium, biotin, trace mineral sources, or when I say improved, I'm talking about more bioavailable trace mineral sources. They're nutrients, right? And so we're meeting nutrient requirements of a cow. We're modulating metabolism through nutrient supply, things like that. And then we have additives like rumensin, which increases propionate production, gives us more intake in milk post calving, decreases ketosis or subclinical ketosis. We got yeast culture, yeast products that and buffers that likely help that rumen transition as well. Mycotoxin mitigators, if indicated. I think there's probably opportunity with sugars also. They're not going to be quite as fermentable, or at least they're not be as likely to drop pH as starches per se, because they're going to ferment it a little bit differently. Not much research though that I'm aware of really looking specifically at sugar levels in fresh cow diets. Okay, so it's hard to make any real research-based recommendations there. I think the whole area of fatty acid nutrition is interesting, right? So we have anti-inflammatory fatty acids. So some of our omega-3 fatty acids and things like that, that again, have maybe some potential here in transition. And then we tend to jump calcium, magnesium a little bit in fresh cow diets. Again, there is still a need for cows to manage calcium metabolism and things like that. Okay. And then finally, we can do a great job with diet, but let's not forget about the non-nutritional factors, right? And so, I think the industry has gained a lot in this area, right? And so we're talking mainly about managing our social interactions or hierarchies, and again, the closer we can get to 30 inches or more, 0.8 meters or more of feed bunk space per animal, close up and fresh. So both close up and post fresh, the better off we're going to do. And cows should have a place to lay down as well. So, space, giving space helps a lot of things. Okay. As dairies grow, they might consider separating cows and heifers, if their facilities allow. The cow heifer competition is a major source of social interaction or hierarchy for the first calf heifers, and so likely going to see responses in those animals. Okay, lots of dairies. If that's not infeasible, if it's infeasible, then I tell people just let's really focus on giving animals more bunk space and more space in those groups, and the heifers certainly will benefit from that. The industry's done a pretty good job of streamlining group changes, right? So, we tend to favor, a move to a close-up group at 21 days plus or minus before calving, and then you're really not moving again until truly calving is imminent, right? Versus these, we used to get into this thing where, herds would move cows again at 7 to 10 days before calving or 2 to 5 days. And so then they get re-socialized and likely going to lose some intake in that time. And just in general, kind of bad times to move a cow. Okay. And finally, it's going to be 90 degrees plus today. It's another hot week here in New York. And so, the whole heat stress, heat abatement story. And, again, the notion that we should be cooling cows, not just during lactation or in the holding area, but we should be cooling them also during the dry period. And certainly the stories that, Jeff Dahl's group at Florida, Jimena Laporta's group at Wisconsin-Madison now, Chatau's group at Georgia, a lot of work and really compelling stories relative to, the long-lasting effects of on the calf, before if it's heat stress, if the mom is heat stressed before that calf is born. Just really, really interesting stories showing, decreased milk production through at least 3 lactations now for those calves that were heat stressed before they were born. Okay. More losses, through the whole time frame in terms of leaving the herd, and even effects maybe on their daughters as well. So just really, really interesting work out of Florida and Wisconsin and now Georgia in those areas. So, but anyways, all right. And then I want to thank you for your attention. I know we've got time for questions. So Scott, I'm glad to do that. And we'll see if I can get, I guess I'll just stop sharing my screen.
All right. Well, thank you, Tom. Before we get started, though, we'd like to share a brief video, and then we'll be right back to answer the questions submitted during today's presentation. The economics of feeding ReaShure precision-release choline. ReaShure is fed during the transition period, and because it's fed for such a short period of time, it costs just $15 per cow, and yet the benefits will continue to generate income throughout the year. Cows fed ReaShure produce 5 pounds more colostrum, which pays for your ReaShure investment on the very first day of lactation. Cows fed ReaShure also produce 5 pounds more milk per day, every day. That means after the first day, every day is payday. Invest in ReaShure during the transition period and recoup your investment on the very first day of lactation. After that, you got it. Payday. All right. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the Q&A tab at the top of your screen. So, Dr. Overton, we've got a few questions already. First one comes in from Kenneth. Says, what is your view on using high bypass fats on fresh cows? Many studies show increased body mobilization with increased bypass fat. Will this be negative or on repro and peaks?
Yeah, I tend to be pretty conservative on fat feeding in fresh cows for the most part. There has been some work done. Adam Locke's group did show more body weight loss in fresh cows fed a higher palm source. There's been some mixed data on that, though. He's got some other data that wouldn't show that. But we're going to tend to be pretty conservative on fat levels. Half or 3/4 of a pound maybe of a commercial fat source, but that's probably about it, which brings us to around 4.75 to 5% fat, no more than 5% fat in those fresh diets. So I don't tend to go crazy on fat sources. I really want, again, we want these cows to come on to feed well. We want these cows to, have fermentable carbohydrates, so we get propionate produced in the rumen that the liver then takes to glucose and supports milk yield. Yep.
All right. Gene is asking, how do pre-fresh fiber and starch levels affect fresh cow performance?
Yeah. So, again, we kind of live for the most part on the era of control energy diets, through the whole dry period. So for me anyway, we're going to tend to run starch levels in a far off diet at 13% or less. Fresh or pre-fresh diet or close-up diet, around 16 to 18. Typically, I don't get too anxious if they roll up a little higher than that, but there's probably not a lot of justification for it. We know, especially if we keep energy down, especially during the far off period, and that's kind of key. That's kind of the key thing. We're going to have better intakes, lower post-calving intakes. We're going to have better or lower post-calving NEFAs, lower post-calving ketones, and things like that. And that certainly is the general pattern for, supporting, control energy diets and their effects on metabolism, post-calving and intake. Again, the big part there is anything we can do to get that cow come on to feed better, post-calving, is gonna be a win, I think, in pretty much all situations.
Yeah, makes sense. Next question comes in from Bruna. Most of the results you showed on the effect of starch and fiber on performance were focused on the performance in the first month of lactation. Should we look into the performance throughout the whole lactation and also the effect on health events, repro, and culling? What is your experience with starch level when considering the whole lactation effect?
Yeah, again, a lot of these studies. So the point there is a fair point. A lot of these studies are shorter term post calving. And we and others. One of the things. One of the things obviously is well, in our case, again, in our case, we're putting cows on the same diet. We follow them for a few weeks, anyway, and then that's about it. And so it's a fair point to look at, lactational studies. They're pretty rare these days, full lactation studies, because they are, you're doing this type of research in a control way where you have intakes and all that stuff is really is expensive. And so you're going to see more shorter term type studies and things like that. All, again, it's a fair point. I don't know if there's enough data out there to look at health events and things like that. Although I will say, we recently published a large, data from a large field study that we did. We did this field study, probably the data were collected probably 10 years ago, and the papers have been rolling out over the last 2 or 3 years, where we had 72 Holstein herds in New York and a couple in Vermont that we enrolled and followed. Really studied diets and studied a whole pile of different things, not only from a nutritional standpoint, but also non-nutritional factors. And one of the things that came through in that data set was that, feeding higher starch diets post calving. Okay. Again, we did have decreased blood ketones, in across those herds. And I think we had a milk response as well. I'd have to look it up to be sure. But, so there was, there was some advantage, and that was, that's thousands of cows worth of data, right? So I think we had positive health there too. I would have to circle back on those papers to be sure.
All right, thanks, Tom. Jerome would like to know, in cows overfed fiber, as in the LeCount study, any comment on the effect on first service conception rates?
Well, I would presume it'd be negative, right? I mean, again, you got less intake in those cows, poor energy. So we don't know, because we actually did not look at that in those cows. Again, small study, so we don't tend to look at repro parameters necessarily. But the combination of lower dry matter intake, more negative energy balance, higher NEFAs, lower ketones, certainly all those would associate with poor conception. So that'd be the speculation on that.
Yeah. Mahmoud would like to know, does increasing protein in the diet cause SARA?
So SARA, subacute ruminal acidosis, I'd have a hard time thinking that it would. Again, you're going to think about that more from a starch, carbohydrate, fiber type relationship there, those post-calving cows.
All right. Jeffrey would like to know, what would be your ideal fresh cow pen length?
I would say 14 days, 10 to 14 days. I think you're going to get, a lot of the dynamic things that are happening in a fresh cow are kind of done by then. And, as long as they're, eating well and off and running, then I think that's probably a good length. I mean, I don't have any issue going 21. If you're going to play around with, again, Trent in his study went 21 days on high protein. I don't know if you have to go that long. I would be comfortable with 14 days there. Again, no data there specifically with 14 days. But, again, you note the Michigan State study where, granted they were feeding a pretty high forage level, in those diets, or forage NDF level, and, they're kind of leveling off on intake by the time they got to 14 days, right? So, we don't want them to level off on intake. We want them to kind of, get off to a start and kind of keep rolling, right? Yeah. So yeah, anything beyond 21 days, in my opinion, is not a fresh group.
Right.
Okay. I mean, you get some of these herds that you get into where, 28 days, 30 days, 40 days in that quote unquote fresh group. And that's really a hard place to be, I think. And so, really should be less than that.
Yeah. What's been your experience, Tom, relative to the percent of dairy farmers that have at least 10 to 14 day fresh group?
I think it's, again, I think you get into freestall dairies that are, I would say more than, I'm just going to throw a number out here, more than 400 cows, 400 to 500 cows. They're going to be super common, right? Now, they may or may not feed us a fresh diet per se, right? But to have a fresh group for, monitoring purposes, controlling your crowding, things like that, I mean, I would say is super common once you get beyond that.
Okay.
Yeah.
But, certainly looks like the data that you've presented, especially some of the protein stuff, that it's worthwhile making sure you're attending to those fresh cows.
Yeah, I mean, the protein thing, right? I mean, if we were to do that in a high cow diet, we'd go broke, right? So, and again, I think our models, once you get into established lactation, our models behave pretty well. I think where we're, but there's the dynamics of protein mobilization in these immediate post calving period. There's stuff going on there that obviously we don't understand, and our models wouldn't necessarily predict some of these responses.
Yeah. Get back to the attendee questions. Penny wants to know, what should the UNDF intake target be for fresh cow diets?
Yeah, so I'm not going to give an exact number, and the reason for that is not all the models are fully seeded with the UNDF data for all the feeds, and so the number is going to vary. I would say, if you're running, I will throw a number, but I mean, let's say your high cow diet runs around 7% of dry matter as UNDF 240, maybe you boost that to 8 or 8.5, probably no more than that in a fresh diet. So, and again, especially if you're feeding it for that no more than 21 days and maybe ideally a little less than that. So you think about a percentage unit, 1 to 2 units, probably above where we run the high cow. And again, I do think, and again, it's been our experience that, blood ketones are a pretty good sentinel for obviously, having actual intake numbers on that group. If intakes go down, right, then that's good evidence that we've gone too far. But blood ketones would be a good sentinel there. One interesting thing I didn't share this. We kind of have a bit of a case study that we did based on that kind of led us down this higher PNDF route, and essentially we had cows. It was really the first part of that starch study that we did. That we ended up restarting the study with higher fiber levels. We started calving cows onto the higher low starch diets, and we had huge health issues with DAs and ketosis, stuff like that. And everything was perfect pre-calving, and it turned out the BMR corn silage and the haylage that we're using was just way better, way more digestible than what we were accounting for, and actually lower in fiber. So we're just shorting the cows on fiber, and we fixed it with some straw. But what was interesting there is when we actually plotted that, looked at intakes of those cows, right? The cow, and granted it wasn't necessarily concurrent, but we kind of looked at it that way. The cows fed the high starch diet with not enough fiber, their intakes were the lowest, right? And we had elevated levels of haptoglobins, an inflammatory marker in those cows. So I mean, we were in higher ketones, stuff like that. But the cows fed the combination of the higher starch and the higher fiber. They had the best intakes. Right. So again, if we match those, this match kind of elevated both a bit. They had the best intakes and looked great metabolically. And then, the cows fed the lower starch diet, regardless of the forage fiber level or fiber level. They were kind of intermediate in their intakes. And I think that's one of the reasons why we got where we got to with lower starch diets is they just are probably a little less likely to be influenced by, fiber level, fiber source, things like that. And I think, but I don't know as they give us the best performance. I think if we transition these rumens well with a little more fiber, these cows will do better on the higher starch approach, metabolically and productively. But anyways, it's a little bit windy there, Scott, but kind of working that in kind of based on experience.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. Kenneth is back with another question. He wants to know, can someone change the fresh cow diets to decrease milk fat production during the first 21 days, trying to decrease fat mobilization? And will this strategy lower body weight during early lactation and increase milk production cost effectively?
So that's an interesting question, right? So back in the when Dale Bauman, and I was, a lot younger at the time, early in my career, and kind of Dale and I teamed up and we did a couple studies looking at, what happens if you purposely feed a trans 10 cis 12 source of conjugate CLA. So that's our milk fat depressor fatty acid. If you purposely fed that to a fresh cow, could you change those dynamics, right? And kind of the bottom line there is we actually could not decrease milk fat until about 3 weeks after calving. So we really did not, and we did not alter energy balance in that. So we were not able to impact energy balance, weight, body condition. And then eventually what they did is they when the milk fat actually decreased a bit, they actually made more milk volume with a lower fat content. So the overall, so it was kind of a wash. So it's a good question. But, in our experience, we were not able to do that. So the cow, for whatever reason, the mammary gland seems pretty refractory to those milk fat depressing, CLAs, at least in the immediate post fresh period.
All right. I've got a question coming in from Carrie. You talked a lot about that protein can increase milk production, but she wants to know why. Why does more metabolizable protein result in more milk?
So, again, don't know. Again, we don't necessarily have a mechanism here, right? We did see a little less body weight loss in those cows as well. But not a lot of evidence of sparing of body protein mobilization. Again, not really sure, right? Being honest, but pretty repeatable. and literature is reasonably consistent here, right? So, again, there's been differences among studies in terms of what they did. I mean, again, obviously we're giving, some of these amino acids are going to be synthesized into other or converted in the mammary gland and other places to other amino acids, right? So, I mean, maybe we're giving the mammary gland options here, right? And so, I don't know. It's a good question.
More research is needed, Tom.
There you go. Right.
All right. Next question's from Wyatt. He'd like to know if you would formulate fresh cow diets differently for primoparous animals versus multiparous animals, and if so, how would they differ?
Yeah. Again, you can make a case the heifer needs, will utilize more protein and things like that. I don't know as I would go beyond what we did, in what Trent did in his study, right? So, I think that's probably hard to justify. Probably not going to do a lot different. There are some data from Ohio State, one of Bill Weiss's students, where they did get, when they pulled a little bit of forage fiber out and replaced it with some non-forage fiber, they did see a response in the heifers. And so, that would be one thing to maybe think about, going to get heifers with lower intake capacity, et cetera. And so, again, a little less filling of a diet may be good for the heifers, right? So again, they had some positive responses in that study.
Yeah. Very well, Tom. We're nearing the top of the hour. I want to give you an opportunity to kind of put a bow on this if you'd like. What would be, one or two takeaways you'd have for the audience?
Yeah, I think the thing I'd like to take away is that I think we're going to see evolution here from fresh cow diets being the high diet with a few tweaks to actually really specifically formulating for the fresh cows. And, that may be, again, we talked about some of those things are straightforward, but I mean, you get, again, a little more starch, or maybe not changing the starch all that much, maybe a little more fiber, the protein thing, choline, other things that we're going to do in these fresh cow diets and things like that. So, and again, it gives you an opportunity if you want to boost the rumensin level a little bit, right? That's certainly something that can be done there as well. And so, we do get nice responses there too. So, again, I think we're going to see diets that look a little more independent than just your high cow diet with just some modest changes.
All right. Well, thank you, Tom, for your lecture today. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. If you have additional questions, please submit them to anh.marketing@balchem.com. The Real Science Lecture Series continues with educational topics each month, including our next one on August 6th, where Dr. Daryl Neidham will present Epidemiology 101, Understanding Dairy Studies. Our full summer schedule of webinars is now available online. Visit balchem.com/realscience for details on future webinars and to register for upcoming events. Balchem's podcast series continues to offer a deeper dive into our webinar topics. Log on to your favorite podcast platform and search for Real Science Exchange or visit balchem.com/podcast. If you want a really cool Real Science Exchange t-shirt, just subscribe to the Real Science Exchange. Send us a screenshot along with your address and shirt size to anh.marketing@balchem.com, and we'll get that off to you right away. On behalf of Balchem and Dr. Overton, thank you for joining us today.